My name's Glenn, I'm 27, and I've always been the quiet one in the family. Not because I don't have opinions or dreams, but because in my family, being quiet was the only way to survive without sparking another round of comparisons or insults. My dad, in particular, has always had a way of making me feel smaller, as if every accomplishment I've ever achieved is just a shadow of what my cousin, Mark, managed to do. If Mark got a promotion, my dad would sigh and ask why I hadn't thought to aim higher in my own job. If Mark bought a car, my dad would mutter about how I was still wasting money on rent instead of investing. It was always something, and over the years, I learned to just shrink into myself, keep my head down, smile when spoken to, and avoid drawing attention to the fact that I was constantly being measured against someone else's yardstick. That dynamic was in full swing at Mark's wedding. It was one of those big, extravagant affairs, the kind where you can practically smell the money in the air, with the floral arrangements taller than me and the champagne flowing like water. My mom had been gushing for weeks about how perfect everything was going to be, and my dad made sure to remind me several times that this was what happens when you make something of yourself. It didn't matter that I had a decent job, that I paid my own bills, or that I had recently been promoted. None of that counted because it didn't compare to Mark's six-figure salary or the house he'd bought with his fiancée. I almost didn't go. Sitting through another night of thinly veiled insults and sideways glances didn't exactly scream good time to me. But my mom insisted, saying it would be unforgivable to miss it. So I put on my nicest suit, one that fit fine but wasn't tailored like Mark's probably was, and showed up, already bracing myself for the night ahead. I remember standing near the back of the reception hall, trying to blend into the wallpaper as the toasts began. People laughed, clinked glasses, and shared stories about the happy couple. For a while, I thought maybe I'd get through it without incident. Maybe I'd just quietly eat my dinner, watch Mark and his bride dance, and slip out before anyone noticed me. But then it happened. My dad stood up, holding his champagne glass, and cleared his throat. The room hushed instantly because my dad has this way of commanding attention, not because people respect him, but because his voice cuts sharp and loud, like he's daring anyone to ignore him. He smiled, that proud, booming kind of smile he saves for moments like this, and looked right at Mark. "Now this," he said, raising his glass higher. "This is what a real son looks like." The words hit me before I fully processed them. My dad wasn't just toasting Mark. He turned his head slightly, enough for everyone to follow his gaze toward me at the back of the room. "Not the failure sulking in the corner," he added, his voice dripping with disdain. "Glenn could learn a thing or two about what it means to make your family proud." I felt the heat rise in my face instantly. The room fell into an awful silence, the kind that stretches and suffocates. People shifted in their seats, eyes darting between me and my dad, unsure whether to laugh, to say something, or to keep quiet. My cousin's fiancée had this frozen smile on her face, like she couldn't believe what she'd just heard. I forced a smile, my lips twitching with the effort, and raised my glass just slightly, as if to play along with the joke. Except it wasn't a joke. It never was, not with him. Inside, though, I was shaking. Shaking with anger, humiliation, and this overwhelming mix of emotions I'd buried for years. All the times he'd dismissed me, cut me down, or told me I wasn't enough, they were all boiling up in that moment. And while everyone else looked away awkwardly, I stared straight at my dad, keeping my smile plastered on even as my chest tightened. Because what no one in that room realized, not my dad, not my mom, not even Mark, was that I wasn't the same Glenn they'd spent years belittling. I had something they didn't know about. Something I had been quietly building, step by step, while they were too busy mocking me to notice. And as I stood there, swallowing my pride and pretending to laugh it off, I realized this was it, the moment everything would change. But I didn't move. Not yet. I just stood there, glass in hand, looking like the same old Glenn they thought they knew. All while the storm inside me began to rise. And that was only the beginning. I stayed in my corner long after my dad sat back down, laughing with the people at his table as if he had just said something clever instead of cruel. My glass of champagne felt heavy in my hand, and the bubbles tickled my throat when I tried to take another sip. It was the kind of silence inside me that wasn't calm. It was the silence of pressure building, waiting to burst. But on the outside, I kept the same half smile, as if I hadn't just been publicly humiliated in front of over 100 people. I thought that would be the end of it. But if I've learned anything from my family, it's that they never know when to stop. Dinner rolled around, and the seating chart was already set. Of course, I was tucked away at a side table, far from the center where my parents and Mark's immediate family sat. Across from me was a group of distant relatives I barely knew. People who nodded politely, but clearly didn't know what to say after what had just happened. Every time I glanced toward the head table, my dad's voice carried above the others. He laughed loudly, slapped Mark on the back, and even gestured toward me once with a chuckle, making some joke I couldn't hear. Whatever it was, it earned a few uneasy laughs from people who were probably too polite to challenge him. I tried to focus on the food, beautifully plated steak and roasted vegetables, but even that didn't go smoothly. At one point, my mom leaned over from the head table, making sure her voice carried far enough. "Glenn, dear," she called sweetly, "make sure you don't embarrass yourself tonight. Mark's guests don't need your sulking face in all the photos." The way she said it, like it was a gentle reminder, sent a ripple of laughter across her end of the table. I felt my jaw clench, my knife pausing just above the plate. The photographer, who had been walking around snapping candid pictures, froze for a moment and glanced at me. I gave him a stiff nod, silently telling him to move on. No use capturing me mid-humiliation. It didn't stop there. When the dancing began, my dad took it upon himself to remind anyone within earshot that Mark was the pride of the family. He kept telling stories about how hardworking and brilliant Mark was, all while slipping in little digs about me. "Glenn always had different priorities," he said once, swirling his drink. Never could quite figure out where he was going. He said it like I wasn't standing 10 feet away. A couple of people gave me sympathetic glances, but no one dared to speak up. The worst moment came when Mark and his new wife cut the cake. Everyone gathered around, clapping and cheering as they fed each other a slice. I stayed near the back again, content to clap politely without pushing my way forward. But my dad wasn't going to let me blend in. He raised his voice above the crowd. "Hey Glenn, why don't you take a good look? Maybe one day you'll understand what it means to settle down properly, if anyone would even have you." That one stung deeper than I expected. Maybe because it wasn't just about success or money. It was about my life, my relationships, the things I kept private. I heard a few gasps this time. People who finally seemed to realize his words weren't just harmless teasing. Mark's bride looked uncomfortable, shifting on her feet, and even Mark himself looked like he wanted to say something but didn't. I forced another smile, but it was cracking at the edges. Inside, I was seething. Every word, every jab, was stacking higher, and I could feel the weight pressing down. But there was also something else building, resolve. For years, I had swallowed my pride, let them talk, let them laugh. But not anymore. Not after tonight. I left the hall for a while, stepping outside into the cool night air. My hands were trembling, not from weakness, but from the effort it took to hold myself back. I thought about everything I'd worked on in silence, the projects, the plans, the achievements I never shared with them because I knew they'd find a way to twist it. They had no idea who I had become outside their narrow expectations. And as I stood there under the string lights, the muffled sound of music and laughter spilling out from the hall behind me, I knew one thing. The next time I walked back in, I wouldn't be the same Glenn they thought they could mock without consequence. The night wasn't over, and neither was I. I stayed outside longer than I planned, pacing along the edge of the courtyard while the muffled beat of the DJ's music rattled through the hall windows. The air was cool enough to calm my nerves, but my chest still burned. I thought about slipping out entirely, just disappearing into the night and letting them tell whatever story they wanted about why Glenn couldn't handle it. But something in me refused. Walking away would have been the easy thing, the old Glenn's move. The one who kept quiet, let them win, let them shape the narrative. Not this time. I finally stepped back inside, forcing my expression into something neutral. The party was in full swing by now. People dancing, clinking glasses, and loosening ties. For a moment, I thought I could blend back into the crowd. But the universe, or maybe just my father, wasn't about to let me. I hadn't been back 5 minutes when I noticed my dad standing near the head table with a few older relatives. He was loud as usual, glass in hand, booming voice rising over the music. I almost didn't pay attention until I caught my own name. My stomach tightened. "Glenn's the dreamer," he was saying, and the word dripped with sarcasm. "Always chasing silly projects. Wastes his money on nonsense instead of investing wisely like Mark. Honestly, it's embarrassing. Sometimes I wonder if he'll ever stop being such a burden." A burden. The word hit me like a slap. I froze in place, half hidden behind a cluster of guests. The relatives he was speaking to shifted uncomfortably, their eyes flicking around as though hoping someone else would cut him off. No one did. My mom, standing right beside him, gave a little shrug and added, "He's always been like that." We gave up hoping he'd change. "At least Mark makes us proud." And then, as if that wasn't enough, my dad reached into his pocket and pulled out something that made my blood run cold. He held up his phone, tilting it so everyone could see. On the screen was my LinkedIn profile, my photo, my name, the job title I'd worked so hard to earn. He scrolled through it with a mocking grin. "See? Middle management. Nothing special. Look at this." He acts like it's impressive, but it's nothing compared to what Mark's doing. Glenn just doesn't get it. always settling for less, always chasing crumbs. I felt my breath catch in my throat. He was broadcasting my life, my career, mocking me publicly like I was some kind of failed case study. The humiliation was so sharp I felt my ears ringing. And then came the final blow. He lowered his phone and said, "Truth is, if he weren't our son, I doubt we'd even bother with him." It was like the floor dropped out beneath me. My own father, declaring to a crowd that I was essentially worthless. I saw one of my aunts glance at me across the room, her face pale, her mouth opening as if she wanted to say something. But she didn't. No one ever did. I don't remember moving, but suddenly I was closer, standing just far enough to catch every detail of my dad's smug expression. My hands were clenched so tightly my nails dug into my palms. For years, I had told myself it was better to stay quiet, better not to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. But in that moment, I realized something had shifted. He hadn't just insulted me. He had stripped me bare in front of my entire extended family, ripped away every ounce of dignity I had managed to hold on to. That was the moment I knew things would never go back to how they were. Something inside me hardened, like a door slamming shut. I wasn't just angry anymore, I was done. And as my dad laughed, still clutching his drink like a king surveying his kingdom, I felt a strange calm settle over me. My humiliation had burned itself out, leaving only clarity. He thought he knew me, thought he could drag me through the mud forever without consequence. But he had no idea what was coming. Not yet. I don't think I'll ever forget the sound of laughter that followed my dad's words. It wasn't loud, it wasn't even cruel. It was the awkward, uncertain laughter of people who didn't know what else to do, the kind that fills the silence when something ugly is dropped into the middle of a room. That was somehow worse. The fact that no one called him out, no one said, "Hey, that's enough." They just let it hang there, as though my worthlessness was some kind of unspoken truth. I felt smaller than I ever had before. Smaller than when I was 12 and he called me useless for dropping the ball in a backyard game. Smaller than when he told me at 16 that I'd never make it because I didn't want to study what he wanted. Smaller than when, at 21, he compared my first real job to Mark's internship at a big firm and told me, "That's why no one takes you seriously." All those moments had carved little cuts into me over the years, but this was a knife straight to the chest. I slipped out again, unnoticed this time, back into the courtyard. My head buzzed, and for a few terrifying minutes, I wondered if I might actually faint. I sat down hard on a bench under the string lights, my hands trembling, my breath shallow. The music and laughter from inside felt distant, muffled, like I was underwater. For the first time in a long while, I let myself feel it all: the shame, the anger, the exhaustion of constantly being the family scapegoat. I thought about leaving. I could call a cab, disappear into the night, and let them drink and dance without me. No one would notice. Or if they did, they'd twist it into more proof that I was weak, that I couldn't handle pressure, that I wasn't a real son. That thought crushed me, because it was exactly what my dad would say later, and everyone would nod along. The image of him holding court, glass raised, telling the story of how Glenn stormed out of Mark's wedding because he couldn't handle the spotlight, made me sick. My fists clenched, and I pressed them against my knees, grounding myself. I couldn't give him that. So I stayed sitting there, letting the minutes drag on, the cool air steadying me. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a notification. I pulled it out, expecting some pointless app alert, but it was an email I had forgotten was scheduled to arrive that evening. I read the subject line, and for the first time that night, my lips twitched into something close to a real smile. It was from a client. A big one. The kind of contract I'd been chasing quietly for months. The kind of deal that could change things for me completely. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I stared at the subject line, letting the knowledge of what I had tucked away sink in. My dad thought he knew everything about me, but he had no idea how hard I'd been working, what I'd been building. He saw me as a failure because I never flaunted my wins like Mark, because I didn't live to impress him. For the first time all night, I felt a spark, a tiny flame of defiance. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and stood, brushing off my suit. Inside, I was still raw, still wounded, but beneath that, something was forming, a plan. I wasn't going to argue with him, not tonight. I wasn't going to throw a tantrum or beg him to respect me. I had tried all that before, and it had only given him more ammunition. No, this time would be different. When I stepped back inside the hall, I kept to the edges again, quiet, unremarkable, invisible. Let them think they'd broken me. Let them think I was sulking, licking my wounds. Because while they laughed and toasted and danced, I was already thinking ahead. They thought they had stripped me bare in front of everyone. But really, they had given me the one thing I needed most: resolve. The days after the wedding felt like walking around with an open wound. Everywhere I went, I carried the memory of that toast, the sneers, the laughter that followed. Even in the quiet of my apartment, away from the voices that had haunted me my whole life, I could still hear my dad's words. If he weren't our son, I doubt we'd even bother with him. It was the kind of line that seared itself into the back of my mind, replaying when I tried to sleep, echoing when I woke up. But as sharp as the pain was, it did something unexpected. It hardened me. For the first time in years, I stopped asking myself why I wasn't enough for him and started asking a different question. Why did I care? Why was I wasting my life trying to prove myself to people who had already decided I was worthless? That email I had gotten during the wedding sat unopened for 2 days. Not because I didn't want to read it, but because I wanted to face it with clear eyes, not in the haze of humiliation. When I finally opened it, my pulse quickened. It was confirmation. The contract had gone through. A deal I'd been quietly working on for months, balancing late nights after my day job, had landed. My freelance side hustle, something I'd kept mostly to myself, was officially turning into something bigger. I remember staring at the screen, realizing that what I held in my hands was leverage, independence, a future that no one in my family had a say in. And for the first time in a long time, I felt powerful. The months that followed were grueling, but I threw myself into the work with a kind of focus I didn't know I had. I started small. One client turned into two, two into five. My weekends disappeared into strategy sessions, my evenings into endless calls and revisions. But instead of draining me, it fueled me. Each new milestone was like a brick in a wall I was building between myself and their insults. By spring, I was making more from my side hustle than I was from my day job. I didn't tell anyone, not my parents, not even close friends. I kept it all close to the chest, savoring the secrecy. I had learned the hard way that exposing my wins too early only invited criticism. This time, I'd let the results speak for themselves. Then came the promotion at work. The same job my dad had mocked at the wedding, the middle management role he had sneered at, suddenly expanded. I was tapped to lead a new division. My salary doubled. My title changed. On paper, I was climbing fast. In reality, I was juggling 2 full-time careers, the corporate ladder by day and my growing business by night. It was exhausting, but every time I thought about quitting, I remembered the look on my dad's face when he waved around my LinkedIn profile. That smug certainty that I was nothing. That memory kept me going. And as the months passed, something in me shifted. I didn't just want to succeed quietly. I wanted to be untouchable, to build a life so far removed from their insults that when the day came, and they tried to drag me down again, their words would clang uselessly against the armor I'd forged. It wasn't just about money, though that came quickly. It was about connections. I started attending industry events, networking with people far outside the orbit of my family. I built friendships with people who saw me not as the failure cousin, but as Glenn, the guy who delivered results, who knew his craft, who had vision. Slowly, I carved out a reputation that had nothing to do with my last name or my family shadow. By the end of the year, I had something my dad could never take from me. Respect. Not his, but my own, and that of people who mattered. I bought a place of my own, not a flashy house like Mark's, but a sleek downtown apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view that made me feel like I'd finally risen above the noise. And yet, I kept my distance from family gatherings. Every invitation was politely declined. Every call from my mom went to voicemail. They thought I was still sulking, licking my wounds, the same way I had slouched in the back corner of that wedding hall. But I wasn't. I was sharpening my edges, building my foundation, waiting for the moment they least expected. Because deep down, I knew they hadn't just broken me that night. They had set something in motion. And soon, very soon, the balance of power in our family would shift. The turning point came in the most unexpected way. By then, nearly 2 years had passed since the wedding. 2 years of grinding, growing, and quietly carving out a life that looked nothing like the one my dad had mocked. My business was no longer a side hustle. It was a company. I had hired employees, leased an office, and landed contracts that I used to think were reserved for people with last names that opened doors. My day job had become optional, and eventually, I let it go altogether. I walked out on my corporate career without looking back, knowing that I had built something of my own that no one could diminish. The funny thing about success is that it changes the way people look at you. Strangers respected me. Colleagues admired me. Clients trusted me. But my family? They didn't know a thing. As far as they were concerned, I was still sulking Glenn, the disappointment who couldn't measure up to Mark. And I let them think that. For now. Then came the phone call that changed everything. It was a Tuesday night, and I was finishing up some contracts when my phone buzzed. It was my mom. I almost didn't answer. I had gotten good at ignoring her calls, but something in me was curious. When I picked up, her voice was thinner than usual, almost nervous. "Glenn," she began, "we need to talk. About your cousin." About finances. That caught my attention. She went on to explain, carefully, that Mark's big lifestyle, the house, the cars, the lavish trips, hadn't been built on the solid ground everyone thought. He was overleveraged. Badly. The company he'd tied himself to had collapsed, leaving him drowning in debt. His wedding, the one I'd been humiliated at, had been mostly paid for with loans he was now struggling to repay. And the golden boy of the family? He was about to lose everything. I remember sitting back in my chair, stunned. Not because I felt vindicated, though, yes, there was a certain dark satisfaction, but because I suddenly realized something important. My cousin, the shining example I had been compared to my whole life, was no longer untouchable. The pedestal my parents had placed him on had crumbled. And then came the kicker. Your father thinks, well, he thinks maybe you could help, my mom said carefully. You've always been decent with money, haven't you? I bit my tongue so hard I tasted blood. Decent with money. That was her way of skirting around the fact that I had quietly built an entire company they knew nothing about. They had dismissed me for years, and now, when their star had fallen, they were circling back. Not because they cared about me, not because they wanted to acknowledge my growth, but because I was convenient. I didn't answer her right away. I let the silence hang, long enough for her to squirm. We'll see, I finally said, my voice flat. After I hung up, I sat in my apartment, the city lights spilling across the floor-to-ceiling windows, and I realized something. The balance of power wasn't just shifting, it had already shifted. For the first time, they needed me, and that need was leverage. In the weeks that followed, more details trickled in. Mark's house was close to foreclosure. His credit cards were maxed. His wife, who had expected a life of luxury, was furious. And my dad, the man who had laughed and called me a burden in front of 100 people, he was suddenly quiet, humble even. He wanted me to sit down with the family and talk options. I went, not because I wanted to help, but because I wanted to see them squirm. We met at my parents' house, the same living room where I had been dismissed 1,000 times before. Except this time, I didn't come in meek. I came in wearing a tailored suit, the kind that fit like armor, and a watch I had bought not for show, but as a reminder of what I had earned. When I walked through the door, their faces told me everything. Shock, confusion. My mom's eyes widened. My dad's jaw tightened. Even Mark, pale and worn from stress, blinked like he was seeing me for the first time. Glenn, my dad said stiffly, thanks for coming. We need your advice. Advice? From me. I sat down, calm and deliberate, and let them explain their mess. And as I listened, my mind wasn't on their words. It was on the opportunity unfolding in front of me. For years, they had dismissed me, mocked me, humiliated me. And now, here they were, laying their problems at my feet, desperate for a solution. They thought they were pulling me into their crisis. What they didn't realize was that they had just handed me the perfect setup. I let them talk. That was the first part of the revenge, silence. For years, I had been the one cut off mid-sentence, my thoughts dismissed before I could finish them. Now, I let them pour their desperation into the air. Mark with his trembling hands, explaining the loans he had taken out for the house and the wedding. My mom, wringing her hands about how unfair it all was. And my dad, the man who had once declared I wasn't worth the breath in his lungs, sitting with his jaw clenched, eyes fixed on me, as though the weight of his pride was battling the gravity of his need. I asked questions, calm and measured, like a banker reviewing a loan application. How much was owed? What assets were still in play? Did anyone co-sign? The more they revealed, the deeper their embarrassment grew. They were unraveling, laying out details they never would have admitted if they weren't cornered. And I sat there, pen tapping gently against a notepad, as if I were detached, just another professional evaluating a case. When Mark finished, I leaned back. The room was thick with tension. You're asking for a bailout, I said plainly. From me. No one answered. My mom glanced at my dad. Mark opened his mouth, then closed it again. Finally, my dad cleared his throat. You're in a better place now, aren't you, Glenn? We've heard things. Success. Money coming in. Maybe it's time you contributed to the family in a meaningful way. Meaningful way. My teeth pressed together, but outwardly I stayed calm. He couldn't even bring himself to say the word help without twisting it into a moral lesson. I smiled faintly. So let me get this straight. For years, I've been the failure, the burden, the disappointment. And now, suddenly, I'm the solution. My mom jumped in quickly. That's not what we meant, honey. You know your father exaggerates. Families support each other. And right now, your cousin needs us. No, I corrected, my voice firm but even. Right now, your cousin needs me. And that's very different. The silence that followed was delicious. For the first time in my life, I wasn't on the defensive. They were. I took my time, flipping through the notes I had scribbled down, pretending to weigh their options. Then I leaned forward, folding my hands on the table. Here's how this will work, I said. If I'm going to help, there will be conditions. Non-negotiable. Their eyes snapped to me. My dad bristled, but he didn't interrupt. That alone told me everything. He knew he couldn't afford to. First, I continued, I'll set up a trust. Any money I provide goes into that trust, and I control how it's spent. No more reckless decisions, no more loans for luxuries. Second, if I do this, there will be no more jokes at my expense. No more belittling me in front of the family, in public, or in private. Ever again. Mark shifted uncomfortably. My mom tried to plaster on a smile. My dad's face was dark red, his pride bleeding out in silence. Third, I said, letting the words hang in the air. If I step in, you acknowledge me. Not as a failure, not as a burden, but as someone who built something on his own. You don't have to like it, but you will respect it, and you will say it out loud. The weight of those words filled the room. My dad's mouth opened, then closed. His fists tightened on his knees. I could see the war waging in him, pride versus desperation. Finally, his voice came out rough. Fine. I leaned back, satisfied. But inside, I wasn't done. Not even close. Because here's the truth. I had no intention of bailing them out. Not really. The trust one had mentioned? It wasn't just a tool to control them, it was a cage. A way to make sure that every move they made from here on out passed through me. They thought they were getting a lifeline, but what I was really offering was a leash. And as I sat there, watching the people who had mocked me for years squirm in their own desperation, I felt something I hadn't felt since the wedding night. Power. And I wasn't about to waste it. I followed through, but not in the way they expected. Within a week, the trust was established, legally airtight, structured so that every cent passed through me. On paper, it looked like salvation. In reality, it was control. Every bill, every expense, every request had to be approved by me. And I was ruthless. When Mark asked for money to cover a trip to clear his head, I denied it. When my mom tried to slip in a request for family support under his name, I flagged it and shut it down. If it wasn't tied directly to necessity, mortgage stabilization, basic utilities, it didn't pass. At first, they pushed back. My mom called constantly, guilt-tripping me, reminding me that family means sacrifice. My dad tried his old tricks, snide remarks, belittling comments slipped between pleasantries. But the difference now was simple. I had the leverage. Every time he snapped, I reminded him that without me, they had nothing. And every time, he backed down. The cracks in their facade deepened. At family gatherings, people whispered. They all knew something had shifted. Suddenly, the golden boy was broke, and the failure was the one holding the strings. It didn't take long for the story to get out. Mark's debts, my intervention, the trust that had effectively placed me at the head of the table. Relatives who once ignored me now pulled me aside, shaking my hand, congratulating me on stepping up. They saw me differently now, not as the quiet, overlooked cousin, but as the one with real power. Mark grew bitter, his pride eroding with every month he had to come to me like a child asking for allowance. His wife, once all smiles and champagne toasts, left him within the year, unable to stomach the loss of luxury. My mom's voice grew shrill on the phone, trying to disguise panic with politeness. And my dad? Watching him choke on his own pride became the sweetest revenge of all. The man who once stood at a wedding, glass raised high, mocking me in front of 100 people, now had to look me in the eye and say, "Thank you, Glenn," whenever I approved another payment. He said it through gritted teeth, but he said it. Every single time. I didn't need to humiliate him publicly. He was already humiliated in the only way that mattered. By being forced to depend on the son he had called worthless. The final blow came one evening when I visited their house to review documents. As I packed up my briefcase, I stood at the same spot in the living room where he had once told relatives that I was a burden. I turned to him and said, calmly, "Do you still think I'm not a real son?" He didn't answer at first. His face was pale, his jaw working silently. My mom looked down at her hands. Mark stared at the carpet. And then, finally, with a voice that cracked under the weight of everything he had lost, my dad said, "No, you're the one holding this family together." I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. I simply nodded, picked up my case, and walked out. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the quiet one in the corner. I wasn't the failure or the disappointment. I was the one they had underestimated, the one they had mocked into silence, until silence became my weapon. And as the door shut behind me, I realized the truth. Revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes, the sweetest revenge is control. The same man who once raised his glass to humiliate me now had to bow his head in acknowledgement. And that was all I ever needed.